This is the third year of the Science Breakfast programs, and I think many of you probably have been with us for almost all that time. We've had, I think, about 20 programs in that period. We've covered everything from artificial intelligence to oceanography and a variety of almost every subject in the science and high-tech field. And I think we've been fortunate in being able to focus on scientists in the Oregon area. And the last couple that we've had, if you've been with us, have done exactly that. Today's program, I think, is probably very close to the heart of the people on our committee. It deals really with the communication of science to the public, and that's obviously what our program is all about. In fact, today, for the first time, we have Portland Cable Access taping the program so that we can get out to more of the public. And we've also in the past had a number of requests for tapes from school districts and other organizations, and we haven't been able to provide them one. This will give us the opportunity to do that in the future. Our speaker today, as you know, is Richard Hutton. Richard is Director of Public Affairs Programming at WNET TV in New York. He's probably best known, at least I think by us, as the developer and science editor for the PBS series The Brain, which I think was on a few years ago, and is the executive editor of the current series called The Mind, of which the third program, I think, was on last night on OEPBS. He's here putting on a joint program with OMG and Good Samaritan Hospital on, I believe, Alzheimer's disease, and I believe speaking over at there tonight. He's a graduate of University of California at Berkeley with a degree in history, which I understand he'll tell us a little bit how he got from history to his current involvement in science. He's the author or co-author of numerous books and articles, and I won't mention all of them, but there were a few that I thought were interesting just because they show the breadth of his involvement, and four of them I thought were interesting. They include the Cosmic Chase. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but others, lifespans, how long things last, biorevolution, DNA, and the ethics of man-made life, and the last one, which I found particularly interesting, food, mind, and mood, which has become a fairly interesting topic, at least for me in the last year or two, and there's been some books that have come out about that subject, which I understand are fairly controversial, but Richard did eat the breakfast this morning and claims that he can perform well, so I guess things are okay. He's also written numerous articles for the New York Times and other magazines, and after having read his biography and not having met him, I thought, gee, he's accomplished quite a bit and must be 50, 60 years old, and the last sentence says he is 34 years old. So that made me feel a little bad. But I think with that, let's welcome Richard Hutton.
Thanks for adding 5 years to my life. I'm 39. I was really surprised that I was going to have to speak at 7 o'clock this morning. And when I was talking to Marianne Watson about it, she kept telling me that I should just keep telling myself that this is really 10 o'clock New York time. This is a clear example of brain over mind, because I keep telling myself that, but my brain doesn't believe it much. I'd like to start by reading a portion of a letter I received from Marilyn Hoyt of the New York Hall of Science when she invited me to speak there last May. Quote, "We're looking forward to your comments, 3 to 5 minutes, on the importance of public science education." 3 to 5 minutes. 3 to 5 minutes is 2 to 4 times the amount of space the evening news devotes to its average science story. 3 to 5 minutes is about what it takes to read the average story on science in your daily newspaper. 3 to 5 minutes to convey a situation as urgent as this one. Last spring I saw a movie called Stand and Deliver. A movie where a computer specialist becomes a high school teacher and tries to teach calculus to ghetto kids in LA. There's a scene early on where he's talking about a basic fact of algebra, that a minus number times a minus number equals a positive number. And then he gets the kids chanting, negative times negative is positive, negative times negative is positive. Everybody in the class is doing it, even the kids who seem to hate him 2 minutes before. And I'm sitting there in the theater thinking to myself, Nobody, no kid, is going to be doing that quickly. And they're still chanting, negative times negative is positive, and he cuts them off. And he asks them, why? That's the question. And I've been asking myself that same thing ever since. Why does a negative times a negative equal a positive? But it's good teaching. I've written half a dozen books on brain and on science and medicine. I've been involved in the Brain series of 1984 and The Mind, which is now on the air. And people inevitably ask me about my background. You blew my punchline, but I'm going to continue anyway. Am I a physician? Am I a scientist who turned to writing? What kind of education could have prepared me to teach people the complicated esoteric fields of science? I love the question mainly because I love the answer. I majored, as you've been told, in history. Science was like food for me, which had been left in the refrigerator too long. It was, in a word, suspicious. Why? I'm not really sure why, but I think I can pinpoint when it happened. In the 9th grade, I took biology. I was interested, but not particularly ready to do any homework. And during the second week, we had our first test. It consisted of a single question. Is a freshly picked tomato a living organism? That was a great question, and it seemed to involve notions of life and death, animate and inanimate material. I wrote like crazy. I handed in my paper, and a week later I got it back, marked with a 0. The answer was, a tomato is not an organism. The answer had been in the homework I had missed the night before. The whole test had been a trick. So I went through that entire year looking for other tricks, and I learned to avoid science. To me, it consisted of lists of uninteresting facts, content without context. And it was only when I got out of college and met an orthopedic surgeon named Stanley Hoppenfeld that I got interested again. Dr. Hoppenfeld was a professor at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx in New York, and he wanted me to write a medical textbook. He offered me $40 a week and run of his college in exchange for my writing skills. So I started to follow him around, and I found out what the cutting edge of medicine is all about. I've been hooked ever since. Why should we stress science education today? The answers are obvious. Before science got involved, our ancestors spent most of their time throwing rocks at rabbits. Before science got involved, thunder and lightning were thought to be the manifested wrath of gods. Before science got involved, the average lifespan was 35. Before science got involved, my trip yesterday from New York to Portland would have taken about 4 months. That, of course, is the science of the past. The science which we clearly recognize as having changed the way we live and the way we think. What we're most interested now is the science of the next decade, of the future. I'm not about to try to guess what it will be. There is an old Chinese proverb that says prediction is very difficult, especially with regard to the future. And Sir Richard Woolsey, England's royal astronomer in the 1950s, was once asked whether manned spaceflight was possible. He answered, utter bilge. In the 1960s, the British tabloids remembered this particular prediction, and when, for instance, Scott Carpenter circled the Earth 3 times, one headline read something like, Carpenter orbits Earth, Americans penetrate utter bilge for 4th time. Nevertheless, we do know what the goals of science are. When we examine them, it's clear that science has insinuated itself into every part of our lives. When we talk about science, we're talking about the possible destruction of the world as we know it, by ecological catastrophe or by human design. The explosion of technology in computers, medicine, transportation, communications, the search for the origins of the universe, the search for the essence of life, the exploration of the very nature of what it means to be human. These are not trivial notions to be summed up by a catchy phrase or a newspaper headline. These are issues that require knowledge, understanding, thought, and true discussion, and they go to the heart of much of science. Science is an extraordinary enterprise. It touches every part of our lives, and unless we make the learning of it an important experience, we run the risk of creating a society divided between those who know and those who don't. A society that is functionally illiterate and ignorant of elements that lie at its very foundations. That's why I can't help but be appalled at the state of science education in this country today. It's not just conventional wisdom that says that science education in the United States is falling apart at the seams. Let's examine some facts developed by the Educational Testing Service in a report that came out just last month. At grade 5, the U.S. ranked in the middle of science achievement relative to 14 other countries. By grade 9, our students ranked second to last. In the last 2 years of high school, advanced science students in the U.S. ranked last in biology and in the bottom half in chemistry and physics. Over half of this nation's 17-year-olds appear to be inadequately prepared either to perform competently in jobs that require technical skills or to benefit from on-the-job training. Only 7% of those same 17-year-olds have the knowledge needed to perform well in college-level courses. Since high school proficiency is a good predictor of whether or not someone will continue to study science, the odds that many more students will embark on future careers in science is very low. One trend that leaps out through these facts is, I think, terrifically disturbing. Our students' deficits increase as they get older. The further they get in school, the worse off they are in relation to students in other countries. The higher grades, of course, are when we ask our students to make the transition from memorizing facts to thinking. And it's precisely at that point when we ask them to think, to solve complex problems, to use their minds, that they do the worst. There's a logical and worrisome portrait of the future that one can draw from these facts. If you agree that science is one of the most significant factors shaping our world, and if our ability to provide effective science education both to our students and to our population as a whole continues to lag behind other countries, then we are probably witnessing the beginnings of our decline as the leader of the world's scientific community. Who's responsible? Scientists, the media, the public. Let me offer you some clues. The following scene repeats itself ad nauseum during the career of any science journalist. The journalist enters the laboratory, sits down, opens a notebook, makes small talk. The scientist, suspicious, says, "Last time I did one of these interviews, the guy got it all wrong. I was embarrassed in front of my colleagues. I don't even know if I should be talking to you." So begins the joust between scientist and journalist, between two sets of priorities so different, so misunderstood. The ritual is like early romance. The scientist thinks, "You're an intruder, but I need you. Can I trust you? Will I be left at the altar one more time?" The journalist responds, "This time it will be different." The public's curiosity about science is evident in many disciplines, but especially when it comes to the brain sciences. We're not talking here about the fleeting existence of quarks, the abstractions of negative numbers, or the movement of tectonic plates. We're delving into the organ of mind, and at higher levels, into what makes us human. Research conducted by neuroscientists may not only alleviate suffering and treat mental illness, it holds out a promise. Someday it may shed some light on why we are the way we are. It's therefore extraordinarily seductive, and the public has good reason to try to understand just where that science is. The problem, of course, is that the public is woefully unprepared to do so. Understanding science demands concentration and discipline, and life is distracting. And so the public, not a captive audience to begin with, wants not only to be educated, it wants to be entertained. Unfortunately, education and entertainment are not Siamese twins. They're irreducible realities which are coupled to each other only with the greatest difficulty. When we produced The Brain, the 8-part series that appeared on PBS in 1984, we received a flood of comments, mostly positive, from the scientific community. But my personal favorite was a scientist in New York who said, "I watched the series and gave you a grade of 67. But don't feel badly. Nobody else has gotten higher than an 8. Therein lies the dilemma, for we're not talking here about a reporter who has taken time off from his night beat in the courts to do 10-column inches on brain transplants. We're talking about a journalistic enterprise that included some of the best documentary producers in the United States, that invested millions of dollars into trying to get it right. And yet, after having spent enough time on the series, about 5 years, to be most of the way toward a PhD in the neurosciences, we still could only manage a barely passing grade. There are two good ways to explain this. First, perhaps that we simply weren't good enough. We had bad people, bad ideas, bad advice. Alternately, it may be that science has a set of standards and priorities that makes it nearly impossible for the journalist to get it right, at least from the scientist's point of view. At one level, the scientist and the journalist do agree. The brain, for instance, supported science. Most people who watched it came away in awe of the scope of the scientific effort in the neurosciences. They claimed to be interested in learning more. So if anything, our series may have helped scientists politically, and it may have tapped the curiosity of school children and adolescents, scientists of the future. But at another level, the conflict becomes clear. Most scientists believe that an accurate portrayal of the process of science is crucial. Facts should be presented as they have been discovered. The issue should be discussed with every caveat, every proviso in place. A piece of journalism that attempts the difficult art of synthesis, that doesn't follow the form or function of journal articles, for instance, is often viewed as vulgar, somehow unworthy, in comparison to science, of course, which is practiced in the higher quest for truth and knowledge. The astonishing thing is that many scientists actually believe this. They conveniently forget the greed, competition, fraud, and undue peer pressure that exists in their world as it does in any human enterprise, in any human world. But be that as it may, the heart of the problem is clear. Most scientists are loath to have their work reduced to caricature, and most journalists know that an article which presents science in all its complexity is an article which is left unread. The battle lines are drawn. The third protagonist in this arena is, of course, the public. The people who should learn about science so that they can make informed decisions about what they want to spend their money on. I must say, excuse me, that I find the public's lack of interest in science frustrating. When I look at the bestseller lists and find that the so-called science books on them usually range from descriptions of meetings with extraterrestrials to pseudo-psychological treatises utterly unsupported by the facts, when I see serious attempts to inform going unheeded, and when I watch people who merely hear the word science draw back in alarm as if they've come face to face with the abominable snowman, I know we're in trouble. It's not just science as it is that frightens people, it's science as they perceive it to be. The problem with science is no different than it is with anything else worth achieving. There's no gain without pain. To understand science, you've got to learn the language. You've got to study its processes. You have to go beyond the headlines to find out what the breakthrough you've just read about really means. There's very little in science that can be taken at face value. What do I mean by this? Let's look at a simple example. We all acknowledge that smoking is bad. The Surgeon General has called it the single most important preventable cause of death in this country. But what does that signify for each of us as individuals? My grandfather smoked heavily until he died at the age of 90 in his sleep. My neighbor smoked a lot less, got lung cancer, and died at 42. The difference? Doubtless it had to do something to do with predisposition. My grandfather was resistant to the debilitating effects of smoking, while my neighbor was vulnerable. But how many in our population really understand what science means when it speaks of predisposition, of resistance, of vulnerability, or of risk? How many know how to assess accurately the risks of smoking, or the incineration of garbage, or genetic engineering, or the effectiveness of electroshock therapy? If we, as members of society, do not know how to evaluate a particular aspect of science, if we haven't acquired a real understanding of what it can and cannot do, of what its risks are, of what its implications may be, then quite simply, we're abrogating our role as participants in the society. We talk, we think, we vote based on poorly formed perceptions, emotions, and illusions, and not on information and careful consideration. Some would say that the very basis of true democracy demands an informed electorate. Where then are we now? That's one reason I've been involved in the kind of journalism I practice. I'm positively messianic, as you might have guessed, about the need to make science attractive, compelling, and relevant, without allowing it to be oversimplified. The two series we've produced, The Brain in 1984, and The Mind this fall, and other series like them are attempts to do just that. They are, in a sense, reality checks, ways of finding out just how serious we truly are about science education in this country. Our latest reality check, The Mind, has now begun its run. It's now nearly 4 years since it existed only in our imagination. In that time, we fought hard to create shows that are accessible and interesting. Since the first day of shooting, over 2 years ago, our crews have traveled to Tanzania, Sweden, Japan, Kenya, Hawaii in midwinter, and we had to throw the footage away. We filmed on a helicopter carrier in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and in the caves of Lascaux in France. We shot about 200 hours of film for the 9.5 hours that ended up in the series, and if we put our editing days end to end, they cover about 3 years. Somehow we ended on schedule and on budget. I have the privilege of standing here today, but you should know that film is the most collaborative medium in existence. 50 people could be standing up here: producers, associate producers, production assistants, cinematographers, editors, our core staff, and indeed the hierarchy of Channel 13 in New York, which supported our project from its inception. As a group, I think that they're living proof that science can absorb, compel, even motivate people from all walks of life, because they were not science people. The effort they put forth to make The Mind a reality was astonishing. They did so, I think, not because it was only because it was their job. The series became their passion. They saw the importance of science, of course, but I suspect they also felt its romance and its excitement. They understand why it is so crucial that this series and others like it be made available to students and the public alike. The Mind, as you know, is a sequel to The Brain, but it was a bit more complicated to produce. Because although The Brain is 3 inanimate pounds, it's still visible. It can be represented visually. So our problem was straightforward. How do we make the invisible visible? Fortunately, while The Mind might not be visible, some of its manifestations in the form of behavior are. So we decided to follow the form of the Brain series, using human stories to drive the science. We decided to do a series not purely on science, but on what science means to society. Not on the mind, but on your mind. We felt that the best way to introduce an audience to the science of mind was to personalize it all, for there is nothing more personal, more relevant in science than the exploration of who we are. For the general public, there's nothing more seductive either. That's why this series means so much to me. If we've done a good job, and if the public does not respond, there are a lot of questions groups like this one will have to ask. I applaud your commitment to science, but I wonder how that commitment can be extended through the schools, the family, through the priorities of our society as a whole, to all of us who have a share in this country. For if we call ourselves a democracy, it all comes down to a simple formula of education, active commitment, considered, informed decision-making. We hear leaders pay lip service to this notion, but it's my feeling that unless we act now to dam our rising tide of scientific illiteracy, the future will curse us for it. I'm a journalist, not a politician. I have no answers. But I believe that focusing our attention and energy on the problem now may be the first step. Thank you.
Richard will take questions, and we should get a discussion going here. So what we'll do is, since we are being videotaped, I'll ask Richard to paraphrase the question back, and let's get started. Question there?
The low ebb of science education in our country today, how do you account for the fact that we still seem to be winners in terms of awards for the Nobel Prize winners?
The question is, if we're at such a low ebb, why do we win Nobel Prizes still? Well, I think that there are a lot of reasons. First of all, I don't think that what we're seeing is the cream of the crop, the people who would be scientists anyway not being scientists. I think they're still becoming scientists. And so I think that what we've established in this country at a certain level, at the highest level of motivation, is a desire to still do science. I also think that the Nobel Prizes are awarded for projects that are often a decade or more old. So I'm not sure that you're going to see that same level of prize winning 10 years from now. I think you may start to see our share of prizes decline in the future. I also think that the substructure of science at the level of technicians, at the level of graduate students, research assistants, and so on, is as important to those prize winners, to science as the prize winners, and I think that may in fact disappear.
You spoke earlier of being your first introduction in terms of biology and being basically turned off to the science itself at that particular time. You said later on that you have no solutions, but do you have any observations of some successful programs that have managed to do something?
I think the Stand and Deliver movie is a wonderful example of what people can do. I saw the movie. I have not met, I think his name is Jaime Escalera. I'm not sure exactly what his name is. But what he seems to do is make mathematics, calculus, relevant. Now, if I were teaching, and I'm not a teacher, but if I were teaching a first-year biology course or a first-year chemistry course, I would let people in the first weeks know why I'm teaching that course. Why is it important for me to learn biology? Why am I sitting here looking at formulae in chemistry? What does it really mean about me and implications for the future? I think that often what we do in classes, and I think that the question of the tomato as a living organism is a perfect example of that, is detach science from the relevance, from its relevance to our society. And I think what any good first-year class should do is do exactly the opposite. Link it so closely to our society that the connection cannot be missed.
You're speaking of science, but if you listen to a political scientist, he'll tell you that people can't tell you what country you're side by side, or any facts about their own lives. In the news type of philosophy we're getting, you get 3 paragraphs about the world in history books, in newspapers. Is there some way where we can turn it around? I applaud your series on the Break of Mind. It's wonderful, and they're teaching me. I'm the same way as you. I wouldn't even know whether tomatoes and animals or not. But I'm learning from those things. But you talk about educational television today. When you throw against all the cable channels that you have, all the glitter and splits that are there, it's a bigger problem than just science. And I don't have a solution either, but it's scary.
I agree. The question was, is it a bigger problem than science? Or aren't we seeing the same thing in all other fields of educational endeavor? And I think the answer is absolutely. I think that what we have, and I didn't say this in the speech, but I really thought about saying it, is we have a societal bent to not paying the price for education. I think that science is simply a terrific metaphor for what's going on all over the place. Science, in order to understand science, and that's why I raised the issue of smoking, you really have to understand its language and the process of science. Otherwise, in my opinion, you're fooling yourself. You're being seduced by that level of sexy breakthrough that sort of says, all right, well, now I know, for instance, in nutrition, now I know what I can do about the state of my body, I'll eat better. Now I know that this will apply to me. In fact, science is completely statistical, and nobody knows clearly what kind of diet will affect what kind of individual. We don't have that kind of knowledge. So what we've got is a case in science particularly where nobody is willing to go forward to understand on the level of the public in this country what science really means and does. I think that part of the problem is that in the classroom today, we have a situation where people really don't care. They're interested in getting out of school, not staying in school. They're interested in walking in the malls. They're interested in doing anything but sitting down in that chair and getting involved in the process of learning. Learning has become passive osmosis instead of sort of an active involved process.
Did you contrast any of the other educational systems around the world? I mean,
I'm a victim of an educational system that didn't even arguably teach me to speak with the proper accent. But the first multiple choice exam I faced was when we wanted to immigrate to this country. All of the others were essay questions. You couldn't just cop out.
Well, the educational testing service survey that I mentioned was a survey that compared us to other countries. I think that we have now developed systems of testing. I agree with you that seem to put a premium on learning a simple fact and not thinking about it. That's kind of what I was talking about. I have not made any comparison, but I've heard the same thing from other people in England. This was a co-production with the BBC, the Mind series. What was interesting was when we started it, actually started The Brain, the man who created the Brain series decided not to find science broadcast journalists in this country, broadcast journalists meaning television journalists, because there were none. So he went to science journalists, writers, found 3 or 4 of us, because he, who was English, wanted to create a tradition in this country of science broadcast journalism. Now that's an ugly picture if you think about it. England has, and I'm not sure the system is going to last, but it has always had a tradition in broadcast, in television, of combining entertainment and education and culture. And this country has always separated it so that, public television is the alternative. And commercial television, which gets all the ratings, is sort of the standard. I think a lot of us would much have preferred to be able to have a tradition that sort of gradually engaged our students and got them involved, as the British system has. Although, as you probably are aware, that system is now falling apart, and the BBC especially is wondering whether it'll survive at all. Yes.
Tell me, at WNET, do you have a lot of opportunity to work with people who create the children's programming there? I'm not sure where Newton's Apple is produced from, for an example. I don't know which of the PBS affiliates, and also, in particular, Sesame Street, which I think has some of us worried, even though I work for commercial broadcasting. Nonetheless, I think that the Sesame Street tradition for science is possibly not a very good model, and yet it's been a model that educators have held up in this country for teaching kids to read.
Yeah, I think you may be right. Sesame Street has been around a very long time, and I don't know whether the model works. I hear people who have children talk about how, well, my child only watches Sesame Street, and sort of think that solves the educational problem of parent-to-child relationship. Television is probably not the way to go, in my opinion, at that level. I think that in a sense it gives parents, Sesame Street may give parents an excuse for abrogating their responsibilities to their children. And I saw a great cartoon the other day. A husband and wife were lying in bed watching television, and she said, how come now, as opposed to 20 years ago, that instead of what we used to do, we lie here every night and watch other people talk to each other? And I think that's what happens in education with families. And I think that one thing that's very important is that we don't expect the schools to do it, that we have to expect parents to do it, because kids are in school 6 hours a day. The parents have control, have responsibility for the rest of their lives. And if parents think that the schools are going to do it, and the schools think that unless the parents till the soil beforehand, nothing's going to happen, everybody's abrogated responsibility and we get nowhere. That shut down the room.
What characteristics of the electronic media would you describe as being particularly suited towards contributing towards improving science education, or the ability to transmit science concepts to the general public or to children, but to people who are not particularly oriented to science itself? How does it have a benefit or an opportunity to do what may not be done by other media?
This time I'll remember to repeat the question. The question is whether the electronic media, what the electronic media can contribute to science. I think that there are 2 ways. One is when the audience is captive, as it is in a school. I think that gives the media, in a sense, a lot more leeway than when the audience is not captive, as with a primetime audience for one of our series. For a series like The Mind, I think that expecting The Mind to educate anyone is an illusion. The mind as a series is a motivating force. Any information that people get from what we do is an added bonus. In 52 minutes, I'm not going to tell you about the development of a child from ovum to 6 years old, physiologically and psychologically. I can't do it. What I can do is tease you enough so that you go out and buy the book, The Mind, or when you read a newspaper, you become more aware of what it says and what it means. Or as a student, you get interested in science and you realize that I'm talking about you. I'm talking about your life, and so you spend more time thinking and considering science. So I think that when it comes to prime time, that what we do is motivate. And perhaps the most important part of a series like The Mind isn't the series at all, but the educational materials that go with it, that go out to high schools, that go out to colleges, and the way teachers use or do not use the series. If you talk about a captive audience, I think you can educate through the media, through the electronic media, and I'm not that conversant with the methods that have been developed, but it's clear that a combination of teaching, media, and reading, I've seen some studies, works better than any one of those alone. Sure, no problem.
You talk a great deal about education and the younger, and getting to the younger generation, basically. But you also spoke of the political realities, and most of those folks who are voting are not in the school, are not in the classroom, are not necessarily reading books at this point. How are they to be reached in your view? How will you, I mean, the Mind series, they may not go out and buy the Mind book. What sort of suggestions do you have in reaching that larger part of the population?
The question is, if we distinguish between those who are still in the educational system and those who are out, how do we reach those who are out? How will we get beyond this motivating tool, the Mind? I don't have an answer. It really disturbs me. It disturbs me not only in terms of science, but in terms of every aspect of politics. I don't think anybody would disagree, no matter where they stand on this next election, that the way the issues have been described and discussed is completely unenlightening, and it's almost impossible to figure out really the complexity at any complex, meaningful level where either of the candidates, major candidates for office in this country, stands on any issue. I think there's a collusion here between the media and the candidates, and also between the candidates' media and among the candidates, the media, and the public. Everybody seems to complain about it. Nobody seems to want to do anything about it. People complain about negative advertising, and yet the polls respond to negative advertising. The media complains that the candidates don't say anything, yet when the candidates publish white papers, the media put no emphasis on it. So at every level, we're all in essence blaming each other. And I think what we've created is a mood in society, a mood that sort of refuses to accept responsibility for our own roles in this decline. And my answer to you is that I suspect that there's not a whole lot we can do about it at that level. But if we think about education, perhaps we can do something about it at the level where people are still, sort of a captive audience, still held to account for themselves in the classroom. I suspect, it's terribly pessimistic, but I suspect there's not a whole lot we can do about it.
What kind of advice do you give scientists about communicating with the public? How do you have to
What advice do we give scientists about communicating with the public? Be human. I'll be a little more specific. When I was talking I was serious when I was talking about how scientists respond to journalists. It's a terrible problem, and the journalists do come in unprepared. There's no question about it, and the scientists have reason to be suspicious. There's no question about that. But scientists often have forgotten the fact that most of their grant money comes from us. They have forgotten quite often that NIH, National Institutes of Health, NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, are sort of the major funders in this country, and if the scientists want to continue the level of funding or increase it, sometimes it's being cut, want to increase it, they've got to respond to the public's desire to know. My feeling about the scientists is that if they could, and I don't know that they can, they should give up the facade that science is this impossible, always correct, always right struggle for truth and knowledge. They should recognize the humanity that exists in science. They should acknowledge their mistakes. They should begin to understand that if I'm a young scientist and I'm trying to get someplace, that I may, in fact, make some mistakes, that I may in fact use fraudulent means to do so, the way everybody else in society does to get ahead. And instead of saying, well, this is some isolated problem that is, outside of our purview, they should set up some institutions that respond to that and attempt to teach the public that science is a human enterprise. I think that what happens is that science feels that the way to protect itself is to keep the ivory tower myth alive, to keep the mythology of science alive. And I personally don't feel that works. I think that pushes people away, it pushes students away, it pushes the public away, and it also keeps the scientists isolated from their rightful place in society. Yes?
Why haven't you found, as a part of the media, why haven't you found that urn of bronze today? Where are these people? It's a well-known fact that students and students cluster around people who are really at the top of their profession, and there are some, we just had some Nobel Prize winners in this country. Who are these people who are doing these things, and why don't we hear more about it in the media? There is no personalization in the media of the scientists, really.
The question is, why has the media left scientists depersonalized? Why are there no personalities like Wernher von Braun, whom people can respect and look up to? And therefore, why aren't they? Well, I'm not sure I agree with you. For me, the Mind series does exactly that. What we've done is, among other things, when you do a series like The Mind, one of the primary problems is casting. We have to go out, and I was talking to Bobby Haggerty this morning about that. We have to go out, and every time you see a scientist up on that screen, you can be assured that we've talked to 30 who haven't worked, who have, for some reason, just been unable to speak the language, been unable to express him or herself, been unable to communicate the life behind the research. So we spend just an inordinate amount of time trying to find the right people so that when we do tell a story, we tell it in a way that will attract, compel, seduce. I give you the opposite side of it. If I'm supposed to make a series like The Mind and I don't have the money to go out and make those casting choice decisions, how can I be expected to have those kinds of compelling, passionate people on the air? And if public television, which seems to be the only alternative, the only place you can find such things, has to fight so hard for funding, I'm talking about 6 years for the brain and 4 years for the mind, how can we be expected to go out there and do the job? We're not getting the kind of support that many other countries give their public systems. Japan, England. This country doesn't have a system that supports alternatives at that level.
One of the basic things we are discussing is financing. Who's going to pay for the science education? Should we have the government have subsidies to certain industries or to certain school districts, or how would we finance the education of our future scientists?
The question is how we would finance the education of our future scientists, and I leave that open to discussion. I think it's a hard question. I think one problem is not a question of, I think finance is one problem. I think that the issue for me is state of mind. I think that we probably put a decent amount of money, we throw money at the problem at a minimally acceptable level. It's A, how we use the money, and B, what we do when we don't need to use money. For instance, the question of family, the question of a group like this. I mean, this is a wonderful idea to have a city club with a science component of people who are committed to getting out the word, to educating the public. Why aren't there more clubs like this around the country? Why doesn't every city and small town have a club like this? Why in New York City do we have laboratories, do we spend enormous amounts of money, and I probably shouldn't say this, on janitors and have science laboratories in total disrepair? What are our priorities as a society? I think that's the question you're asking. And I think that the question of priority in society is only partly a monetary one. It's partly a familial one. I really put the onus on family in the end. I think that the government has to contribute, should contribute, does contribute to an extent, could contribute more. But it's the state of mind of this country which is so disturbing. Its inability to to face the fact that it's so necessary for us to respond to the challenge of science today at every level.
In one of your series, you showed a gentleman who'd lost his short-term memory. And I can't help wondering, do you think that's happening here in the sense that the problem you need to solve may be a 20-year problem, but we can't perceive it as that. We just can't perceive problems and solutions over that long period. And so you just never get the connectivity between doing what you need to do today to solve the problem 20 years from now.
The question is about the first, it uses the first show of the mind as a metaphor for the problem in this country. Clive Waring, who was in the first show, who has no ability to remember anything or to store new memories. And whether or not our inability to store new memories is part of the problem, our desire in essence for immediate gratification at all times, I think absolutely. I think people are elected for 4 years, they're elected for 8 years. In the House of Representatives, they're elected for 2 years. They spend these days, and I'm sure this isn't what the founding fathers of this country meant, they spend their first 2 years getting ready to campaign for their second, and their second for their third, and so on and so forth. I think that's exactly right.
So you have to demonstrate the fact that it's a long-term problem.
We have to demonstrate the fact that it's a long-term problem. I don't think we have to demonstrate the fact that it's a long-term problem. It is a long-term problem. Everybody knows it's a long-term problem. Nobody is willing, as far as I can tell, to do any more than pay lip service to that fact and to commit themselves to the sacrifices that requires. But people know it. I think what we've got is a dichotomy between what we know to be true and what it takes in this country to be elected, to be successful, because what we've done is confine success now to short-term goals and not long-term goals.
Could you contrast that with other countries like Japan and Germany?
I really don't know enough. I can't. But I have a gut feeling, it's an intuition and not fact, that there are traditions in other countries which make breaking away from long-term goals a lot harder to do, that we're more mobile, that we're more able, more fluid, more able to as society speeds up, as communication becomes instantaneous, as transportation gets me here in just a few hours from New York, we're much more flexible, plastic, and capable of adapting to that, to our own detriment ultimately, and perhaps other countries, and this is again a guess, may not be as able to adapt as quickly. And so long-term goals used to be what people used to think in terms of lifetimes. Now they think in terms of months. Any more questions? Yeah.
I recently went to my daughter's science class and at an open house at night, and she's in middle school. And most of us in the class were quite surprised and disappointed to hear that a third of the science class in the 8th grade was being devoted to discussion of non-science issues, gangs, how to deal with gangs, how to deal with some of the sexual diseases and things like that are pressures on society that weren't felt before. And what that's doing is it's taking a major percentage of the time in that class that they're spending on science. Is that do you perceive that as being a sort of a national problem in education, or those kinds of pressures doing just the opposite, as opposed to spending more time on science issues which are becoming more complex, they're actually spending less time?
The question is, actually, I'm going to change the, I think I understand that the question is, now science classes are spending time on what teachers and educators perceive are more relevant topics, like sexual abuse, what were some of the others? Gang wars and so on. I think what's happened is that the educators, and whether that means that we're spending less time on the science, I think the answer is, at least from my point of view, that educators have bought the idea that science isn't relevant. And so the assumption is that the immediate relevance of sexual abuse, gang warfare, is more relevant, some quote unquote, somehow, than science, which, if you go into, biology and you learn about the flatworm, seems irrelevant. Well, it seems to me that what we're saying is that the educators have now bought the story that science is not as relevant as other aspects of society, and that it's easier to teach, and it's easier to seduce students to learn when you deal with these very relevant topics. I think that the problem is inherent to what we've been talking about the whole time we've been here, that science is not so easy, and that we have to spend the time to do it. I think that is happening, and I wish it weren't. I think it's sad.
Let me push that question a little further into scientific ethics, as it were, or the kinds of ethical questions that young people and that adults in society have to face. Let's say in terms of organ transplants, of investment in life at one end as opposed to another, in environmental issues where there's an economic challenge on one side and a long-term survival of the planet on the other. Where is that going to be taught, and have you thought about trying to do a program series on that as well?
The question is, where are we going to teach ethics? And the questioner raised many of the ethical issues that we face today. I have two answers. One, I was in law school, it wasn't mentioned, for 3 months once, and the best line I heard was that ethics are like tooth enamel, either you have them or you don't. The other is that PBS is putting on a series this winter from Fred Friendly's Media and Society group at Columbia University on ethics, a 10-part series. Those are the seminars where Arthur Miller or Charles Nesson stand in the middle of 15 people and put them through what Fred Friendly calls the agony of thinking. And I think they're wonderful. They're wonderful television. So we're trying to respond to that. Where it gets taught in school, I think you've got the same problem. It's hard to understand the ethics of a problem unless you understand the facts behind the problem. I think we ran into that in the first presidential debate, where Mr. Bush seemed to have an enormous difficulty working through the issue of abortion, and had to confess on air that he hadn't really thought about step 2 once he had thought about step 1. And there are people who were appalled by the level of thinking that had gone into the rhetoric and had not gone into trying to understand the nature of the problem. So I think that ethics starts at home and ethics goes to the top. Yes.
I've been impressed with the New York Times coverage on scientific stuff, rather depth too, and many, many subjects which are beyond my comprehension. It has national coverage too. What's your opinion on that?
On the New York Times?
Yeah.
I really like the Times. The question is, what's my opinion of the coverage, the science coverage going on in newspapers around the country, and specifically in the New York Times, which has a Tuesday section called Science Times. I think it's a wonderful start. I think it's an important contribution. I think scientists denigrate it constantly because it doesn't do what they want it to do. But that's exactly what I was talking about before. Here's an effort by a newspaper to devote 4, 5, 6 full pages a week, plus some of the week in review, to science. And scientists sit around in meetings and laugh at it. And what they should be doing is supporting it, helping it get better, and doing more in their hometowns to get their hometown newspapers to be doing the same thing.
Back to this question on the science teachers. I was lucky enough to have a mother who's a science teacher, but most of the reading I do would say that the number of qualified science teachers in the junior high and high school are falling something like 40% of them are qualified to teach. So it is easier to teach gang warfare than it is science if you're not qualified to teach. So maybe we need to think about ways to invest back in to our science teachers. I remember my mother as a child was gone every summer to some stipend someplace to learn something new in the field of science. Today, they're not qualified to start with, and there's no system that supports them to have new knowledge unless they take away from their families for 3 months every summer to go do it.
The question is, are we also talking about the sorry state of the education of science teachers in this country, even as we talk about everybody else? I agree. I think it's terrible. I think that what we've got now is a system that doesn't demand, for instance, continuing education, and that many teachers who teach at that level, when they teach various levels when they teach at primary levels of education, they might have concentrated in history or in English, and so they're adequate teachers in that regard, competent. But a lot of science teachers didn't start out as science majors in college, and so they really didn't learn anything but what's in the book in front of them. And that book may be 15 years old and may be completely out of date. Yeah, I mean, they're as frightened of science as the rest of society, many of those teachers. We have an incredible dearth of talent of science teachers in this country. I think that, again, Stand and Deliver, the movie, demonstrates that. Here walks this guy out of the computer industry who expects computers in his school in the ghettos of Los Angeles, has no computers, starts a course, and wipes out, in terms of his success, math teachers from all over California and his ability to get his students to learn. That should say something not only about whether or not it can be done, but about the quality of his competition.
It seems to me a lot of the problem has to do with a general lack of respect for intellectualism all over the country. A lot of these problems really relate to this lack of support. You know, our heroes are football players, scientists. Do you have any comment on that or suggestions?
The question is, are we now faced in this country with a declining respect for intellectual activity, which is, one example of that is the fact that our heroes are football players, sports heroes, and so on. My only comment is that I agree. It's the way this guy, you know, I'm 39. But it just, you know, I've got some friends who have children who are in elementary school and junior high school, and the people they respond to seem very different from the people we responded to when I was in elementary school. Maybe I don't know, maybe my perception is jaundiced by now, but again, I think it's a question of state of mind of society. I don't know how you change a society's state of mind. I don't know how you change an individual's state of mind. But it seems to me that ultimately, unless we take the threat to society seriously, and what you're doing is giving another manifestation of that threat, that we have, we're right back where we started, in a society which is declining.
I'd like to thank again Amzi and Good Sam for bringing Richard to Portland. And again, Richard is speaking tonight at Amzi, is that right, Nancy? Nancy said? At 7:30, and that's open to the public, right? And he's talking about the science of mind, bridging biology and behavior. So we encourage everybody to go to that. Thanks again to Richard. I think we all